In mid-July, the New York Post reported that New York has seen a massive exodus of millionaires, causing an $11 billion loss in tax revenue, according to a new study. The story was picked up by a variety of news outlets and social media and has become part of a larger discussion in America about the right rate to tax millionaires and billionaires. The original study was conducted by the Citizens Budget Commission, or CBC, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit civic think tank that analyzes the finances, services, and policies of New York City and the state government. Their most recent study was a comprehensive look at New York's changing population, demographics, and economy. But the part on tax revenue was actually a component of a study they released in August of last year. So it seems like people are using numbers to give a narrative, and the loss they claimed is pretty staggering. So our ears perked up to the possibility someone might need their methodology examined. And today, we're taking a look at this original CBC study, how they got to an $11 billion tax loss, and whether we can trust these stats or if they deserve the bad kind of asterisks. Hello and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast where we look for the madness in the methodology. I'm your everyman host, Brent Buckwright, here with a man who needs no introduction, but he's going to good and well get one. It's Dr. Steve Bronars. Steve, how are you?
I am doing very well, Brent.
Perfect. All right, so let's just kind of first start with the scope of the study, because much of the reporting is trying to connect it to policy decisions and advocacy from the current mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani. But the study itself actually covers the period of 2010 to 2022. And at a base level, they try and look at the share of the country's millionaires that lived in New York in each of those time periods. And then given that percentage change, estimate how much tax revenue New York would have gotten had that percentage remained the same. So my first question for you is, what do you think of this initial approach? You know, before we get into any of the details of it, what do you think of that attempt at trying to make sense of whether or not keeping millionaires is going to help your taxes, or whether changing taxes has affected and discouraged millionaires from staying there?
Yeah, and I think that the first thing that's noticeable about it, in addition to the time period that you're talking about, is that it's not clear that there was any policy change over that period. So when we're looking at these kinds of studies, we're usually saying before and after something. And this is just a difference in trends. And so another way of looking at what they were doing was, well, the number of millionaires, and this is again, according to IRS filings, doubled in New York City as well, but it tripled in a bunch of other places. And so those are different trend paths. And the question would be, what are the different things that would account for it? And I don't think it's a very good study for trying to disentangle all that. There are a lot of different factors that would go into why the growth rate for the number of millionaires in New York City was slower than the other places. How much of that is due to their marginal tax rates, which obviously much higher than Florida and Texas, where they don't have state income taxes or city income taxes. But it's not that different from some of the other states they're comparing New York to. So I think it's really unclear why there was such a difference in the growth rates of millionaires in the different places. I don't think the study really goes very far in explaining that.
Yeah, I think that we always want to be sensitive to the constraints of whomever is conducting the study. There does, to me, feel a little bit in this study that there is an attempt to connect particular tax policies with outcomes. They never go so far as to make the direct causal claim, but it does feel, as you read it, like there's some connection here. I think one of the major takeaways that they had just on the share of millionaires. In 2010, New York State had 12.7% of the country's millionaires, and in 2022, it was 8.7%. The other three major comparators were California, Florida, and Texas. Those each saw an increase. And so while the number of actual millionaires doubled in New York, they tripled in California and Texas and quadrupled in Florida. I think that if you're looking at this particular time frame. So New York, I don't believe, had any major tax policy changes over the time, as you mentioned. There was, I believe, a tax increase in New York City in 2021, but that's pretty close to the end. So probably not the main driver of what's happening here. The question would be, if you're trying to connect it to taxes, first you would need to look at what the tax changes were in those other states. But then I think that if you're looking at that period, there's a couple of major economic changes that probably need some disaggregation before you could get anywhere close to making a causal link. So the two ones that I think about are the massive tech boom in California and Texas, and then COVID.
Yeah.
And neither of those really get any light shed on them.
Well, and again, there are these trends. And the first thing I would say is that New York's population, New York City, New York State, it's been pretty flat for a while. So the fact that the number of millionaires doubled without really adding much in the way of population is, the share of the nation is going down. But Florida's a state, Texas state that's been growing a lot. So, not even accounting for that, I think is one thing, in addition to all the economic factors. Now, the stock market went up a ton between 2010 and 2022. So, New York is a financial center. A lot of people's wealth in New York will be tied up in that. Like you said, in California, it's tied up in tech. So none of those different factors are really being accounted for in any way. But all that being said, there's no doubt that if you raise tax rates, you're going to lose businesses, you're going to lose people. The question is how much.
Right.
So it's not. There's no reason to doubt that there is a negative impact, especially if you think about. And I don't know exactly how the New York taxes work, but you don't necessarily even have to move that far to change the tax rate that you're paying. And then you have the idea that if people are earning a lot of this income in a more passive way, it's capital gains. It's not like they have to uproot where their business is in order to relocate for the purpose of taxes. I think the reason why it's in the news so much is because a bunch of places are thinking about changing the tax rates on higher earners, and everybody's kind of concerned about ultimately what the ramifications of that would be. But I don't think from this particular study we really know, other than it's probably not going to help if you raise tax rates on retaining businesses. It's always relative to the counterfactual of what if we hadn't done it? And we have no idea, had there been a different tax policy from this study, what the trend would have looked like. But economic theory would say be different,
I mean, so the economic theory is pretty clear. If you increase the cost of being in a place, less people are going to be in that place. I think that there's certainly different ways that economists can structure different kinds of taxes, and some have more distortionary effects than others. The thing that strikes me is that when you're reporting numbers like this, there's an implication of number go up good, number go down bad. That because New York has lost its relative share of the country's millionaires, there is a baked-in assumption that things are worse for New York relative to other places. When it could be the case that that there are different areas where more millionaires are being made. Like a millionaire is not some geographic feature or static feature of reality. Different areas can develop more or fewer millionaires. And as you point out, even the study notes that there are more millionaires in New York at the end of this period. And for a stable population growth, that could seem like a good thing. It just might be the case that an area that didn't have very many millionaires found a way to attract a lot of new people or develop new wealth that wouldn't have previously existed.
Yeah, and the data that they rely on, like I said, is from the IRS. It's hard to know what industry and occupation. We know these headcounts, but I've looked at the data, and the population historically in New York City over the last couple decades is pretty stable in terms of how many people are moving in and moving out on an annual basis. And we know that from census data. Florida, Texas, California, they're much more dynamic, people moving in and out than like New York City in particular. So there is something that is going to keep people there, and different places could have different elasticities of responses to a change in the tax rate. And I think that the reason why this story gets traction is because in a bunch of other places on the ballot in California, there's going to be this billionaire tax. Washington State doesn't have an income tax and now is going to tax people who earn more than $1 million in a year. And everybody's going, what's going to happen there? And so I think the economics profession really needs to be able to explain to people, obviously it's not going to be a perfect fit everywhere, but in generally speaking, what would happen, because it'd be unfortunate to go, well, we're going to try this and see what happens. Like in Washington State, we'll start taxing people on income over $1 million, and we think it should be okay. And I'm sure they've done some studies of it, but I'm not sure they're up to the standards that would be needed to be able to accurately predict how many people are going to leave the state or how many people are going to leave the city or the region or whatever based on this one thing. I think it would take a while to see the results play out. I don't think it's something that's going to happen overnight. And maybe, like you said, more important, who you're attracting rather than who you're losing. Like there's some, mobility cost, transaction cost to think that you're going to leave over and I don't even know what the change in the tax policy that this is supposed to be talking about. But let's say there was a change in the tax policy.
Right.
I think it's the people that are thinking about moving, they're deciding which place to move. All of a sudden, New York, Washington, California, whatever, moves up or down the list with a whole bunch of other factors that are pluses and minuses. But it's not going to help that you're going to keep less of your money if you move to a place now because they've raised the tax rate. The question is how much, given everything else that's in the decision that you're making, how much does that matter? And again, I think that from this study, it's just, some simple comparisons over time, not clear what are the many different factors could account for this. But I think a lot of it has to do with a pretty stable population, as opposed to some of these other states where they're growing. And then in California, where they generated a lot of wealth in terms of the tech sector. That's why their number of millionaires were growing. But again, given its IRS data, it's really hard to figure out who these people are, where they're coming from, where they're going. And so we have these headcounts and not really sure exactly what you can make of that.
Yeah, so I want to get to the second component. The first component is there does seem to be a lower share of millionaires living in New York State, in New York City, 12 years after 2010. Okay, that you might take that as true, but we've got some underlying population questions. The other component is, let's assume that New York had been able to maintain that constant percentage. What would the tax revenue they would have gotten been? And I think that this is particularly interesting because they show for New York State, if they had maintained their 2010 population, they go year by year and show how much the revenue would have been, and then they take out what the actual revenue for the state was. The starkest thing you see in their reporting is that in 2020, 2021, and 2022, the revenue that they would have gotten had Millionaire stayed greatly outdwarfs the rest of the period. Is there anything that you make from that? And are there any concerns you have in the methodology when so much of it seems to be disproportionately located in the time frame where COVID was going?
Again, it really depends on
on the one hand me with your economy.
Right. Now, it depends on what the source of the higher income was. I think COVID is one thing, but it's also movements in stock prices, and when people decide to realize those capital gains and make those transactions. I think that where this income is coming from is probably not people's wages and salaries. It's investment income, and then when they decide, okay, I'm going to realize these capital gains and sell this asset, and then have to pay tax on that. And so I think I noticed that same thing. It's really some unusual jumps there, whether it's due to COVID or coming out of COVID, whether it's due to changes in, people's valuations of their portfolios or just their decision to cash out, reach a certain age or whatever else it is that's motivating that decision. So it's really too hard to tell, but that is very suspicious how much it was concentrated in that time. I just think in general too, obviously if there are more people, I don't know how you get more millionaires there, because they didn't really present evidence that they moved away. It was like, had we been able to create more millionaires, we would have created more wealth and more income, and the tax base would have gone up. So I don't even understand really that comparison. Yeah, if everybody in New York made more income, given the progressive tax system, more would have been paid in taxes. So I'm not really sure where they think the millionaires went. I don't think they left, or did we not attract them? So I don't think it was all that well thought out, because you could say if we, this many thousand millionaires moved to other places, and they could have moved to New York, and they didn't move to New York. And so what is the effect of that? Or we had this many thousands of millionaires leave New York City and go somewhere else had we kept them. It wasn't really clear to me how you keep your national share without adding people in some way or converting their income. It was, I think, a poorly thought out analysis. It would have made more sense to say we lost these folks had we kept a higher share of them, or we didn't get our share of movers, right? Because I think the people you're going to get are the people that are already moving. And you go like, well, they didn't choose to move to New York. They moved to Connecticut. They moved to New Jersey. They should have moved to New York City. Right. But it's not that kind of study. It's a very high level study. But that would be something that you would think about.
Yeah. And I think you'd probably also want to look at, if you believe that certain cities or states have a large percentage of their population, that their income stream falls in a very specific industry. New York City is a very clear example that a lot of these people are making their money off of investments. You might want to add in some layer of, hey, there's a cap on the total amount of capital that will be in the country at any point in time. There's going to be a limit to the number of millionaires that this kind of place could make without completely changing the industry that runs New York City, right? They don't have the ability to switch to doing something else in the same way that you might if you had more space in California or Florida or Texas. So the number of options to either attract or create millionaires might be more limited. I did think one thing that was kind of interesting was the reporting on New York City residents having a basically 14.8% marginal personal income tax rate. The state has a 10.9%. And then the city adds on an extra, 4%. This is higher than California's 13.3%. The thing that stuck out to me about this was, if you're saying, okay, there's some connection here, New York is choking out its millionaires, or they're maybe they're staying, but no one's coming. They didn't give a specific narrative to that, which is fine. Pointing out California is the second worst. And then also the state that did the second best in millionaire growth has no state income tax. I don't know what to make of that, if I'm supposed to think that the taxes themselves are the worst thing in this equation. There's a lot more going on in these economies that matters, and myopically focusing on a tax hides part of the bigger story.
Yeah, but I think that what it requires is a study that controls for multiple things. Like you said, the industries that are located in an area and how those industries are faring could explain some of the differences. And like you said, changes in just the size of the population, because a lot of things are happening at once. And like we said already, there was not really a identifiable change in the policy. So we're really trying to explain, as opposed to a before and after type study, why trends are different. Why is this state growing at one rate and another state growing at another? Would be a similar type of question. You go, well, there's a lot of different things that go into that. Way things are covered in the media and the way things certain groups that are advocating, they're going to focus on the one thing of the entire list of things that would matter. And like I said, it's not going to help to have high tax rates in terms of attracting businesses to locate, unless, and this happens. And when we talked about this in our episode about Tulsa, sometimes you have these high taxes, then you give tax breaks. That's more for businesses. And so I don't think there are any kind of individual tax breaks. But the other thing is that if you are in New York, you may decide how to manage your portfolio differently because they're going to charge that if you're very wealthy, they're going to charge, and you live in New York City, that extra almost 15% if you realize the capital gains on your investment, whereas that wouldn't happen in Florida or Texas. So the amount that you're collecting in tax revenue depends on what the person realizes in income, because we don't tax unrealized capital gains. So two people with the same kind of investment portfolio might manage it differently, and they might just still be as wealthy in New York, but they go, I'm going to wait until I move to Florida, and then I'm going to change my position in this and make millions of dollars and keep that extra 15% because I'm not in New York right now. So I don't know. It's such a simple study, but the point would be, are there a bunch of wealthy people in New York that limit how much they're changing their positions, knowing that every time they have to realize some capital gains, they're going to pay tax on that? And why do that until you're in a more favorable tax situation? It's kind of like the logic behind the retirement plans and stuff. You put the money aside when you're in a high tax bracket, and then you take it out when you're in a lower tax bracket. That would happen in different states. So it's so unclear what's going on here. But I think the main thing too is that there's still quite a few millionaires in New York
Yeah.
and in New York City. It's not like we said, the number doubled. And the point of this study is it should have done more than doubling for reasons that are not 100% clear why they think it should have happened. And I don't think that the slightly higher marginal tax rate in New York helped. But I think your point is exactly right. It's only slightly different than California.
Yeah. And it's
Where
incredibly
it
different in
tripled.
Florida, and Florida did worse than California.
Yeah, but I think, like you said, that's like running a regression on one explanatory
Sure,
factor.
sure.
And it's not even clear what the explanatory factor is, other than trends will differ across these things. It would be more convincing if there's a change in the policy and then you see, oh, here's a response. And even though that is fraught with difficulties too, you have, as assuming things would have stayed on the same trend path, and now the trend path changes. Now you're arguing about, well, what else could have changed the trend path? What else happened
Yeah.
simultaneously? Which is kind of getting to your COVID point. But we're not even talking about a change in the trend path. We have a single trend, and we're trying to say, why was it lower here and higher there? I think not really the kind of study that you would want to attach much credibility to. But like I said, there's definitely been a change in Washington state. I think that passed. And I'm not sure it's going to be constitutional in California with their wealth tax, but there's pressure to tax wealthy people at higher rates.
Yeah.
And so it would be kind of good if we knew what would happen in your area if you did that, because it may be bad. I just don't think we can tell from this study.
Yeah. And I just said that California did better than Florida. If you were looking at the multiplier by which Florida went up versus California, Florida looks like it did better. So looking strictly in percentage terms isn't always the best thing, in my opinion, because this is an example where the raw number of millionaires added to California is greater than Florida. And maybe you actually think that's more important than the share relative to the rest of the country.
I just find this share relative to the rest of the country, this is an interesting thing compared to, if I told you, and I unfortunately don't have the numbers here, but Florida gained population between 2010 and 2022, and New York really didn't. And so that would account for part of it. And I think would be much more compelling if you were able to show that there are a bunch of millionaires that relocated to Florida.
Yeah, it's like your
And they
millionaires
left New York
per capita, right?
the millionaires per capita, and
Yeah.
they were moving because, like you said, it's one thing to say that they were creating that wealth and income there, and the other thing is that they were creating it somewhere else, and they decided to relocate. They're successful, and they're going like, here's a better place to be successful, Florida.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what's implied there, but it's not clear how that happened in Florida. I think it probably is related to migration, but you don't know. You
Yeah.
really don't know from that study.
So sometimes we do, parts per 10,000, parts per 100,000. You want to do one part per millionaire, right?
Yeah.
So I do have a question for you, Steve.
Yep.
As we kind of wrap up, is there a way you would want to get more from this? Is there something else that you think they could have looked at, or an approach that you think would have improved this? I think a great study, for example, would be let's hold everything in the country constant and then just change our tax rate slightly so we can finally map out that Laffer curve.
I think that there have been some studies that have been done on this that have tried to look more carefully. I don't know what data they had access to, but I think you really need to kind of follow people over time. And I do think that this geographic mobility thing matters in terms of that's what you're saying. I think that the best way to try to identify the causal effect, even though there's no guarantee you're getting a causal effect, would be a change where you could make the argument. The main thing that changed here was this one tax policy, and we look at the consequences of that. So I'm not aware of what happened between 2010 and 2022 in any of these states that caused it to be substantially different. So I think you have to really try to find in the data some opportunities to exploit those relationships and to be able to statistically identify those effects. So I'm not sure what they could have done with this. It is interesting that, like I said, they're using IRS data. You don't know, like in the census data, anybody who's a millionaire because all of the incomes are top coded.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you could look at high income people and see how mobile they are. And definitely the higher your income is, the more mobile you are.
Sure.
So I maybe something could be done, not with millionaires, but with high income folks that, they have an income of $500,000 or more or something like that. Again, it wouldn't be IRS income. That'd be what they report to the census. You wouldn't know exactly what it was. And if you saw changes in tax policy that caused people to move or not move in that group, I think that would lend some credibility to this. So I think following individuals over time, seeing are they moving or not, would be an important part of this, because that's I think that's what the point of this is, that we're losing them to somewhere else, or they're not coming here, as opposed to these millionaires or these people close to being millionaires in New York. They just weren't putting in that extra effort to get above the $1 million threat. Like they're slackers making $750,000
if they could just
a year.
have worked over Christmas Eve.
That's right. They could have pushed themselves over the $1 million threshold. So yeah, I think that it's kind of limited what they could do.
So, in closing then, as we always like to do, what's the letter grade you'd give this study? I'm putting this at C- D+ territory, because I think while it never tries to make direct causal connections, I would argue it's pretty suggestive. I do think they give decent just base statistics. So the fact that they're not making stuff up is a pro in their camp. And then decent graphic use. I think they laid it out at least cleanly, even if I don't love the methodology.
Yeah, I think I would give it a C. I think that you're lowering them based on, and maybe the whole point was to get news coverage, that I think our opinion of it is affected by how it's being misinterpreted, or maybe not misinterpreted. People are interpreting it the way they want to.
And that shouldn't be on the study.
It shouldn't be on the study, but still, it's still only a C.
Okay, Steve, you're suddenly a millionaire in New York. What's the first thing that you're buying?
A nice down payment on a penthouse apartment.
Nice. Okay. I think I'd probably get front row seats to the play Oh Mary. Those are so expensive, but everyone says great things about it, and I'd love to see it. Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.